Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 9th of November. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. First let's take a look at the Russian sources map, this one. As you can see there are a lot of icons in this area and the first icon we got from the area, from the small town by the name of Snegirivka, this one. A lot of videos ago, when we discussed the Ukrainian counteroffensive operation in this area, I told you about triangle between Snegirivka, Kherson and Berislav. This is like the focal triangle that the Russians are using for preparing their defense orders in this region. And I told you that if the Ukrainians started any counteroffensive operation, we would see the beginning of that operation in direction of Snegirivka. And that happened. If we are talking about today's update, we got a report from this area that today is the third day in a row when the Ukrainians are trying to penetrate the Russians' defense orders in this area. So we can say that the final battle for Kherson started at least 3 days ago in direction of Snegirivka. We haven't received a lot of reports on this area. The Russian sources and the Ukrainian sources were trying to hide this operation. I believe that there was some kind of communications, negotiations between the parties and so on. But the thing is that Ukraine started, and today, as you can see, we got the first updates about the fact that the Ukrainians got control. First, they got control over a small town on the east side from Snegirivka, from Kalinovska. We got some updates with the Ukrainian flag. And by this evening, we got update that there is a Ukrainian flag raised above the Snegirivka, above this town. It was like the freshest update. During the day, we got update that the Russians destroyed at least 4 bridges in this area. The bridges that located on the south from Snegirivka, these 2 bridges, and 2 bridges that located on the east side from Kherson. This one, Daryevsky Bridge, and this bridge as well were destroyed. According to the Russian source map, there is no update about this bridge, but if we take a look at the Western sources map, you're gonna see that there is an icon saying that the Russians destroyed this bridge as well. And later, during today, we got update that something is going to happen this evening. And the Russians' Telegram channels, the Russians' military experts, this morning started talking that this evening of local time, some important updates, some important notes, some Russian official authorities, military authorities were planning to say. And this evening we got update from the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, Shoigu. He was talking with the head of this operation, Suvorikov. Suvorikov made a report about the situations on the front line, about the situation on Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye area. The head of this operation, Suvorikov, told about the situation on the south from Bakhmut in this area, Kurdyumovka. He told that the Ukrainian army were completely defeated in this area, were destroyed, and that the Russians had a great success in this area, and that they're continuing storming the Bakhmut. Also, the head of this special operation, Suvorikov, were talking about Pavlovka operation, that the Russians are storming, pushing, and that Ukrainians had a lot of losses. Also, he reported about the situation in Kherson, that in Kherson situation is fine, that we are still there, we are holding the position, and so on. But after his report, Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, asked Suvorikov what is his opinion about the situation in this area, and because of like difficult situation and so on. And Suvorikov reported about that situation in this area are very difficult. It's very difficult, and he suggested that to leave this bank of the river, to prepare position on this side of the river, and something like this. And Shoigu agreed. And as you know, this evening, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation ordered to start evacuation process of the military forces of Russian Federation from this bank of the river on that bank of the river, and to leave this position and to leave Kherson for Ukrainians. For now, this area is still under Russian control. As you can see, the Western source map shows the flag that the Ukrainian got control over Snegirivka. And so we can say that by this evening, at least the Ukrainians established control over a few towns like Snegirivka and Kalinovskaya, these two towns, I believe that tomorrow and the day after we're going to see more and more updates that Ukrainians are taking town by town in this area. But this is not the most important. For me, at least for me, I have at least two questions or maybe two things I would like to discuss. The first one is that the Russians destroyed the bridges along this river, this Ingulets River. And to be more precise, the Russians destroy every single bridge on this river. And from now on, the Ukrainians or the Russians don't have possibilities, at least they don't have any bridge or anything that connects two sides of this Ingulets River. So let's build a small line. Now we can say that the Russians' front line in this area are split in two parts. The first one, let's call it Kherson front line, and the second one is Beryslav front line. And these two areas are not connected between each other. All bridges are destroyed, and the only way how to do this, the way how to do this is to build pontoon bridge and something like this. For now, there are no more other option how to do this. And this is very interesting because of the fact that the Russians, according to the previous reports from the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation and previous updates that we got from this front line, because you remember that the Russians reported about success on this front line almost every single day. And today they also got update that during the heavy clashes on this area, the Ukraine lost around 110 soldiers and something around 22 armored vehicles. So I believe that there are still forces on this front line. And because of the fact that these bridges were destroyed, that means that these forces from this side of the river, the Russians are not planning to move these forces from this side of the river in direction of Kherson. As we know, there is a pontoon bridge near Antonovka bridge this is the famous bridge that the Ukrainians were trying to destroy during the previous months using the HIMARS rocket. And there is like pontoon bridge, there is not just pontoon bridge, there is a lot of boats that the Russians are using for evacuation process and for supply support process and so on. And that means that these forces, the Russians are not planning to use these forces for these evacuation purposes. That means that the Russians or have already left this bridgehead, and we haven't just received updates about that, or they are still there, but the Russians are planning to use, let's say that there is another pontoon bridge near, let's say, Novokakhovka in this area. I wrote this icon softly. Maybe there are no bridge in this area at all, and these forces located on this bridgehead, let's say on the right side of this river, will be used they will use this bridge for evacuation, and the forces located on this area will use Kherson bridgehead for evacuation process. This is the first thing. Interesting thing. Another interesting thing is that I believe, I'll give my opinion, that it is highly unlikely that the Russians are able to complete the evacuation process of their military forces without agreement with the Ukrainians. You need to understand that if we take a look at this map, we see that Kherson district is like a part of big area and so on. But from, let's say, some other perspective, this is some kind of island. That island is a place that's surrounded by the sea, by the water and so on. In this case, there is no sea, the water around this area. But if we're talking about this area, you see that from the north, there is an Ukrainian territory. So that means like a sea. And the Russians, of course, are not planning to use this area to evacuate or something like this. If we're talking about the south area, there is a river, and there are no bridges in this area at all. There are no way how to evacuate armored vehicles, tanks, artillery system from this bank of the river on this side of the river in a safe way. There is just pontoon bridges and boats that the Russians are able to use for evacuation process. I'm not sure about the number of Russian forces in this area. I'm not sure about the real number, but as I know that during the previous weeks, the Russians managed to move around 100 or 150,000 of civilians on this bank of the river. I'm not sure about the number of Russian army forces that the Russians managed to move on this bank of the river, but I believe that there are a lot of forces there. There are still a lot of forces there. And if we're we will listen for the Ukrainian authorities. They talk a lot about this situation, and they managed to give their own notes about their own understanding of this speech that we heard today from the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation and the head of the special operation, and that told us the following: that according to words of Russian authorities, they announced about evacuation process. But if we're talking about the ground and the situation, the Russians haven't moved their forces from this bank of the river. It's their words, the Ukrainian authorities. They haven't moved. Furthermore, they continue moving more and more forces, like engineering forces and so on this side of the river. Let's say that the Russians did really decided to leave this bank of the river. It's highly unlikely that the Russians are able to evacuate from this area without an agreement with the Ukrainians. To tell the truth, it's impossible. Because imagine yourself, some Russian sources provided some numbers about this front line. They told that if we're talking about the Ukrainians, there are around 60,000 soldiers from their side. And if we're talking about the Russians, some sources were saying that there are around 30,000 of the Russians on this front line. Maybe some forces were already moved, but even in this case, I believe that there are still at least 10 or 15,000 soldiers in this area with tanks, with armor, and the most important, with ammo and shells, with equipment and so on. And all these things needed to be evacuated on this side of the river. And only the Ukrainian goodwill, to be more precise, a gesture of goodwill from the Ukrainian side, is the only one way how to evacuate from this area. And now let's discuss one more time the Sullivan, who had some track with the Russians about negotiation process, about the peace agreement and so on. And later he talked with Zelensky. So I believe that there is some kind of negotiation and some kind of agreement. According to this agreement, the Russians will have some time for evacuation process. I'm not saying that this process is endless and that they have an endless period of time. I believe that the Russians needed to complete this operation by, let's say, by the end of this week. Or on the other hand, the Ukrainians will attack the Russians in their back and they will reduce the Russians as much as possible. And this is a very important thing. This is a very important part of negotiations. I believe that there is negotiations. Because I repeat myself, it's highly unlikely, and I believe it's really impossible to evacuate from this area the Russian army on this bank of the river without any proper negotiation that the Russians and the Ukrainians managed to achieve. And now there is just one thing, and as we discussed in the previous videos, are the Ukrainians planning to follow these negotiations? Because from the Ukrainian perspective, they have a real chance, a real opportunity to attack the Russians in their back and to destroy a really big army on this bank of the river, and maybe to finish this war. Because if there are around 20 or 30 or 50, no matter, 1,000 soldiers of the Russians on this bank of the river with armor, with equipment and so on, and now they need to step back and, to tell the truth, even to run away on this bank of the river using the boats to cross this river as they can on their feet, the Ukrainians have possibility to attack in their back and to destroy this big army. And we need to understand that if the Russians will be defeated on this bank of the river, that might cause to big strike in the Russian Federation. And of course, civilians and the Ukrainians will show a big picture of big defeat of the Russians on this bank of the river. This situation might bring us to a very big strikes in the Russian Federation, in army, in military, and everywhere, and in any other place. Situation is very difficult. But from the other side, we understand that if the Ukrainians break the deal and attack the Russians while they're retreating, this might lead to unbelievable consequences. The Russians are able to, first of all, to reduce the entire energy facilities in Ukraine. Now we're talking about 35-40% of energy facilities. I believe that the Russians will be able to reduce the energy facilities in Ukraine up to 80% and even more. And to force the Ukrainians, let's say, to start a big migration process from the east side of Ukraine to the west side of Ukraine, because as we know, the West Ukraine have been connected the energy facilities from the West Ukraine have been connected to the European Union, or to be precise, to Poland energy system, and now this territory is completely automated and isn't connected. This territory isn't connected to the east side of Ukraine. Situation is very difficult, but anyway, I believe that now we're the witnesses of the beginning of the end of this war, or at least this conflict might be freeze till the next year or something like this. If we're talking about the words of this head of this special operation, Suvorov, he reported that the Russians are planning to use this force on this bank of the river on other parts of the front line. But we heard the same thing in Kharkiv district and in many other places. Yes, if we're talking about some kind of perspective, we understand that it is much more easier to protect this border, let's say this front line, because it's highly unlikely that Ukrainians are able to cross this river without bridges. Yes, we know that during the previous supports from the United States of America, they supported Ukraine with a lot of armored boats, but it's not enough to develop a real offensive operation in this area. If we're talking about this area, the length and this river is very wide. Even in this, it's up to 800 meters, and the Ukrainians need to build these pontoon bridges, so I believe it's highly unlikely that Ukrainians are able to build pontoon bridges in this area. They are able to send commandos and scouts on this bank of the river, but I'm not sure that they are able to prepare real bridges and to move a lot of forces on this bank of the river and to develop their offensive operation in Zaporozhye area. So from the Russian perspective, yes, they if we take a look at the front line is around 210 kilometers. I believe that maybe 10 BTGs is enough to hold these positions, and of course the rest of the forces can be moved, let's say, to Zaporozhye area, to Donetsk, and to complete the operation around Peski, Avdiivka, and so on. If the Russians are planning to do this, or maybe the conflict is going to be freezed for some period of time. So let's see, let's follow. But anyway, I'll repeat myself that evacuation from this bank of the river is highly unlikely without negotiation process and agreements between Russian Federation and Ukraine. If we're talking about other front lines, there are no changes on the front lines. The Russians are still trying to storm and attack Pavlovka, Ugledar front line, Konstantinovka, Novomikhailivka. There is like icons in this area. The Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukraine lost around 80 soldiers and something around 10 armored vehicles on this front line. If we're talking about area around Donetsk, there are no changes. That the only thing update that the Russians, as you can see, this updated map, and now they're moving in direction of Vodyane to the north along this forest, along this small green area. They're moving to the north, reducing the Ukrainian fortification and trenches in this area, and now they're trying to attack Vodyane from the south. And there are clashes there, and I believe that maybe in a day or two the Russians are able to take this area. If we're talking about Avdiivka, no changes from this front line. If we're talking about Bakhmut, there are very heavy clashes there. As you can see, there is like an icon showing the battle. And as you can see, the Russians are storming let's say, Bakhmut from the north, trying to... The first thing that the Russians want to do is to establish control over the east part of this town along the river Bakhmut, the river moves here, and the Russians want to take control over the part that located on the east side from this river, and then they will be able to continue storming of this area. If we're talking about, let's say, Solidar, Belogorovka, Seversk area, today we got another report about the fact that the Russians, when they were talking about Belogorovka, they were talking about South Belogorovka, but not about the north one. That means that the Russians decided to concentrate their forces on attacking Bakhmut and on encirclement of this town. For now, the Russians are in the south part of this area, and they continue clearing operation. I believe it will take some time before they will be able to complete this mission. If we're talking about the losses, the Russians didn't provide any numbers from this territory. If we're talking about Kupiansk front line, there are the same updates, the same towns, the same titles: Kuzyomovka, Novoselovka, Stelmakhovka, Plashanka, Chervonopopovka, and so on. The Ukrainians made the same attempts, the same attacks. All their attempts were repulsed by the Russians, and during the previous 24 hours of clashes in this area, the Ukraine lost around 160 soldiers and something around 13 armored vehicles, and at least one confirmed artillery system. So let's follow the situation. And we will follow Kherson defense operation or Kherson evacuation, the progress of Kherson evacuation process. We'll see, because this is very important. And I'll repeat myself, I believe that there is a deal, and if Ukrainians break the deal, I believe that in this case we're going to see something more and something new on this front line. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.